The laughter started low, a dry rattle near the stove that caught and spread through the cramped hall, the way brush fire catches dry grass in the autumn of 1884. Verity Ashcombe, 31 years old and dressed in mourning wool, gone thin at the elbows, heard it from the back row. Her sister's elbow pressed hard into her ribs. Drummer's flank warm against her dark skirts. The auctioneer lifted a curling sheet of paper, squinted at it the way a man squints at something he's grown tired of reading aloud, and called the number. Everyone in the room had been waiting all morning to mock. 110 acres of broken shale and dead grass. He announced the kind of land God forgot to finish, with a hollow in the rock, big enough for bats or fools. Who'll open the bidding at $15? The crowd's mirth rolled louder, hats tipped back, boot heels knocking against the floorboards. Near the front, in a coat too fine for a working man's funeral season, stood Obadiah Thorne, his spine straight as a fence post, his face turned toward the auctioneer as though his daughters-in-law did not exist behind him at all. A week earlier, he had pressed two small purses into their palms without once meeting either woman's eyes. His study lined with ledgers, the lamp turned low, though it was barely past noon. "The boys are gone," he'd said, his voice flat as a closed account book. "You're no longer Thorne women." He'd called it their husband's due, as if grief could be counted out in coin and tied off with string, as if the fever that took Thaddeus and Caleb within 10 days of each other had been some debt finally settled between the living and the dead. Verity had wanted to throw the purse back into his face right there on his own good carpet. Instead, she'd closed her fingers around it because Honor, 26 and 8 months a wife before becoming a widow, was standing beside her hollow-eyed in a borrowed black dress 2 sizes too large. And someone needed to keep walking forward when the floor itself seemed to be tilting. Now that same purse sat heavy in the pocket sewn beneath Verity's coat, $15 between them, and whatever winter intended to do to two women with no roof of their own. Honor's gloved hand found her sleeve, gripping rather than resting. "We are not bidding on that," her whisper sharp enough to cut through the noise of the hall. "That land is a joke, Verity. Everyone in this room is laughing at it, and they'll laugh at us twice as hard if we own it." Verity's eyes stayed fixed on the auctioneer's raised chin, on the way Thorne's shoulders had gone rigid without him ever turning around to look at either of them. "Let them laugh," she said, and the words left her before fear could catch up to stop them. The room did not get louder. It got still, the particular stillness of a held breath, heads swiveling one by one toward the back wall where the two sisters stood. The auctioneer blinked into the dimness past the lamp smoke. "The widow Ashcombe," he said, more question than statement, and Verity gave a single nod, chin level, refusing to let her hands shake where anyone in that crowded room could see them tremble. Thorne turned then, slow, deliberate, and what crossed his face first was disbelief, and beneath that something colder. The particular contempt of a man who has just watched his own discarded property refuse to stay discarded where he'd left it. Someone near the stove muttered loud enough to carry across the hushed room. "What's she want with Rattlesnake Rock?" Another voice answered, low and ugly, half laughing already. "Maybe she means to farm the bats for their guano." Honor's grip on her sister's sleeve tightened until it hurt, her breath coming fast and shallow beneath her high collar. But she did not pull Verity back toward the door, and that small mercy was the only thing keeping Verity's spine from buckling entirely under the weight of every eye in the hall. 15 once. The auctioneer's voice thinned with relief, eager to let this particular embarrassment be finished. 15 twice. Outside wind dragged grit along the boardwalk steps, audible even through the hall's thin, clapboard walls. Thorne said nothing, and that silence struck Verity harder than the muttering had, harder than the laughter, a wound with no visible mark left on the skin. Sold, the gavel cracked against the table clean and final as a door slamming shut, and the crowd parted in that stiff, sideways way people make room when they want distance without admitting to wanting it at all. Verity counted the coins onto the table one by one, while the auctioneer's eyes kept drifting toward Thorne, as though expecting the old man to intervene and put a stop to this foolishness before it became permanent. He never did. He stood watching with his jaw set hard beneath his gray whiskers, and when Verity finally folded the deed into her coat and turned to leave, he stepped into her path long enough to deliver 3 words like a verdict passed down from a judge's bench. "Rock and ruin." She held his gaze the length of a held breath, her bonnet brim shading her eyes from the worst of the lamp glare. "Then you'll have no cause to miss either," she said, and walked past him with Honor stumbling to keep pace. in skirts too long for the broken floorboards, drummers' claws ticking against the wood behind them, both like a small steady drumbeat counting out their retreat. The road out of Briarstone Crossing ran 3 miles through pale scrub and low stone ridges, and they walked it with bedrolls slung over their shoulders, a sack of flour and dried meat between them, an iron skillet knocking against Verity's hip with every stride. Honor said little, her face turned toward the horizon, as though she could will it into something gentler than what it actually was beneath the flat autumn light. "You should have asked me first," she finally said. Somewhere past the second mile, her voice thin with held-back tears, she refused to let fall in front of the open sky. "You didn't even look at me before you spoke up in that hall full of people who already think we're fools." Verity kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, her boots already raising small clouds of pale dust beneath her hem. "There wasn't time to look at anyone, Honor. The hammer was already lifting above the table. I had to choose before he could see me hesitate, before any of them could see it." That answer did not satisfy her sister, and Honor's silence afterward carried its own kind of accusation, one that would not be the last to pass between them in the weeks ahead. The land rose before them as the sun dropped low and orange toward the western ridge, a blunt shoulder of stone breaking from the surrounding scrub, and at its base the cave opened dark and wide, its mouth cut into pale limestone that looked less like shelter and more like something the earth had swallowed whole and forgotten to close again afterward. Honor stopped walking entirely, her bedroll sliding from her shoulder to the dirt. "This is what $15 bought us," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "No porch, no walls, nothing but a hole in a rock and a wind that wants to skin us both alive before the month is out." Verity set her own bedroll down without answering right away, studying the black opening, the way the failing light pooled at the limestone's edge, and went no further into the waiting dark beyond. "There's water somewhere near," she said finally, untying the ribbon of her bonnet to let it hang loose against her back. "Thaddeus told me once, riding back from town on a clear afternoon. He stopped right about here and said the ground was too stony to plow, but the cave underneath was something dry as stored grain if anyone ever had sense enough to use it properly. I asked him what man would bother with such a place." She let the silence finish the rest of the thought for her. "Now the answer's neither of us has a choice left in the matter." They made camp short of the hollow's dark gap that first night, close enough to watch its shadow, far enough to keep one eye fixed on the gathering stars instead. Verity built the fire small and fed it sparingly from the brush they had gathered along the last mile of road, watching the flames throw orange light over pale stone before losing themselves entirely at the edge of the darkness, beyond where nothing moved and nothing flickered back. Honor lay curled against her bedroll with her back deliberately turned to the hollow, refusing to look at it even once. And when Drummer's low growl rumbled in the deep hours past midnight, both women came awake at once, hands reaching instinctively for the knife laid between their bedrolls. Nothing answered out of the dark but wind and the slow settling crack of cooling stone somewhere within the rock. Honor's breath came ragged in the firelight, her loosened hair sticking damp to her temples despite the cold. "I don't know how to do this, Verity," she whispered. "I don't know how to be the kind of woman who survives in a place like this, who builds anything out of nothing." Verity reached across the narrow space between their bedrolls and found her sister's bare hand cold and trembling beneath the wool blanket. "Then we learned together," she said, low and certain, though certainty was the very last thing she actually felt in that moment. "We've buried husbands within 10 days of each other. We can bury fear too if we have to side by side the same way." Morning came pearl gray and merciless across the eastern ridge, and Verity rose stiff-shouldered to feed the last of the kindling into the coals before lifting the lantern toward the limestone gap. Honor stayed back near the dying firearms wrapped around herself inside her thin coat, watching with an expression caught somewhere between dread and a reluctant, unwanted curiosity. "Guard the door." Verity told Drummer, and the dog sat without hesitation at the stone threshold, ears pricked toward the dark beyond his mistress's retreating shoulders. The cool air closed around her the moment she stepped inside, thick, with a stillness that felt older than the woods outside, older even than the wind that scoured the mesa above, a waiting kind of quiet that pressed against her ears like water. The lantern threw weak yellow light against walls that opened wider than she'd expected from outside the floor, packed earth worn smooth in places where something, water or time or both together, had moved through long before she'd ever arrived to claim it. She walked deeper, listening for the rush of hidden streams or the flutter of disturbed wings, hearing only her own breath. And far behind her, the faint click of Honor's boots, finally daring to follow her sister into the unknown. Dry Verity thought, running her gloved palm along the cool stone. Not damp, not slick, no smell of rot anywhere in the close air. Dry as her husband had promised on that ordinary autumn afternoon, dry enough to actually matter now that the promise had become their only inheritance. Honor caught up to her near the chamber's widening throat lantern light flickering uncertain across her pale face, her breath visible in the cooler air. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," she admitted, voice quieter now, stripped finally of its earlier bitterness from the road. "Maybe big enough for something." Verity didn't answer right away, already turning the shape of a plan over in her mind, the hard bones of one rather than anything fully formed yet. "The sheep would have to come first," she said at last, her voice echoing faintly off the unseen ceiling above them. "Everything else starts with the sheep, or we have nothing to build toward at all." They had not spent every coin at the auction, whatever the town believed of two desperate widows acting on impulse alone. Before the gavel had ever fallen, before either of them had even set foot inside that crowded hall, Verity had sold her wedding china and Honor's late mother's silver candlesticks. To a trader passing through on his way west, the money set aside carefully in a tin box, buried beneath the floorboards of the house that was no longer theirs to live inside. Combined with what little remained of the funeral purses after the journey's small expenses, it gave them $11 beyond the price of the land itself. Enough, if they were careful with every cent, for 10 thin ewes from a rancher, glad enough to unload the weakest part of his flock cheap before the worst of the cold settled in. Honor had argued against the purchase, even as Verity counted out the coins into the rancher's calloused palm. Certain the animals would die of cold or coyotes before spring, regardless of whatever shelter the two of them managed to build. Certain the whole venture amounted to a slow and humiliating way to starve, in full view of a town that already expected nothing better from them. But 10 sheep stood now in a makeshift pen of brush and rope, just outside the hollow, bleeding uneasily at the strange stone shadow looming over their huddled backs. And the argument itself had already been spent along with the coin that bought them. The pen had to move inside before the first hard frost arrived in earnest, away from both wind and predators alike, and Verity walked the cave's depth, with a stick in hand sketching the rough shape of posts and crossbeams in the dust, while Honor watched from a few paces back, arms crossed tight against the chill seeping up from the stone floor. "We don't have nails enough for a proper structure," Honor said, picking at a loose thread on her cuff where the calico had begun to fray from the road. "We'll use rope where we run short," Verity answered without looking up from her sketching. "We'll make do with whatever holds together long enough to matter." The nearest stand of timber sat nearly 3 miles off in a wash, where spring runoff kept young trees clinging stubborn to life through the dry months, and the sisters set out together the following dawn-axe, and saw slung across Verity's back a coil of rope looped heavy over Honor's shoulder. Both women in plain work dresses, already gray with dust from yesterday's long walk. Sleeves pinned back at the wrist the way their mother had once shown them for kitchen work, never imagining the lesson would serve them out here beneath a Wyoming sky. The work fell unevenly between them from the very first swing of the axe. Verity's blows landed true and hard, jarring up through her shoulders with each strike, sweat sliding down her spine, despite the cold morning air, while Honor struggled to find any rhythm to the motion. Her smaller frame unsuited to the axe's considerable weight, her palms raising welts within the first hour of steady effort. "I'm slowing you down," she said through gritted teeth, watching Verity's chosen tree finally lean and crash down into the surrounding brush, startled birds scattering skyward at the sudden sound. "You should have left me back at the cave to mind the sheep instead of dragging me out here to fail at this too." Verity wiped her brow with the back of one wrist, leaving a faint streak of dirt across her forehead. "You're not slowing anything down," she said. "You're learning the rope work faster than I ever managed myself, and that's worth considerably more than swinging an axe badly all afternoon." It was true, though Verity hadn't fully realized it until the words had already left her mouth unbidden. Honor's fingers, clumsy and uncertain with a felling axe, moved with sudden, surprising grace whenever it came to knots. Instead, her hands finding the right tension and twist, almost by some buried instinct, securing each drag log with a precision that made the rope hold true under strain, where Verity's own hurried knots had already slipped loose twice that same morning. Days folded into one long, unbroken task after another, fell and drag and measure and dig and brace and lash, until time itself stopped feeling like separate hours and started feeling only like the next single thing that needed doing before dark. Verity's shovel struck packed hardness only inches into the cave floor, forcing her to scrape deeper with a flat, sharpened stone. Instead, her wrists aching constantly from the hand drill she used to bore holes for the corner posts one by one. Honor took to working in the chinking instead, learning to mix mud from the nearest seep with dried grass and wool combings, too dirty to ever sell at market, packing the mixture carefully between the fitted logs until it dried hard into something close to solid stone itself. By the fifth evening, the pen stood finished at last, square and graceless and entirely honest in its construction. And the sisters drove the flock inward with soft sounds and careful, patient steps, watching the animals hesitate long at the dark threshold before one brave ewe finally stepped through and the rest followed close behind in a nervous, huddled mass. The bleating changed once the flock moved inside the deeper chamber, softened and blunted by the surrounding stone, and Verity latched the gate with hands raw beneath a thick layer of dust, feeling something loosen behind her ribs that had been clenched tight ever since the auction hall's mocking laughter. Honor sank onto an overturned bucket nearby, too exhausted by then to lower herself with any remaining grace. The day's work already raising welts beneath the dirt ground into her once soft palms. For weeks after Caleb died, she said quietly, staring at the finished pen rather than at her sister beside her, "I felt like every door in my life was being shut from the other side. Somebody else's hand always on the latch deciding for me. This is the first one I've actually helped close myself with my own two hands." Verity sat beside her on the cold stone ground, shoulder pressed to shoulder, and for the first time since the funeral, she let herself genuinely believe her sister might actually choose to stay through whatever came next. They counted the remaining coins by lantern light that same night. $8 between them now. Not enough for any mistakes, not enough for the smallest comfort, perhaps enough still to keep moving forward if they kept noticing what others around them had always overlooked. Verity rose before dawn the next morning and walked deeper into the cave with the lantern raised high, retracing steps she had only half registered during her first exploration, searching now with deliberate, careful attention to every shadowed crevice. Near the rear wall where the stone narrowed and climbed steadily toward a ceiling lost entirely in shadow, above a faint darkness touched one particular section of limestone, not wet enough yet to glisten, not even wet enough to properly catch the lantern's light, just a seam where moisture gathered slow on the coldest mornings and thinned away again by the time the sun reached noon. She crouched low and watched one single drop form slowly, cling stubborn to the stone and finally fall into the dust collected below. By itself, it meant almost nothing at all. Through a long, hard winter, it might mean the entire difference between survival and surrender. Honor found her there, crouched against the wall, an hour later, her lantern guttering low, and crouched down beside her sister without a single word of complaint about the cold seeping steady through her skirts. "What is it?" she asked, and Verity traced the path the water seemed to want to take along the weeping stone, already imagining barrels and gutters and tin scraps, if they could somehow afford them. A way to catch what the rock itself offered instead of hauling buckets endlessly from the distant creek once the ground froze solid for the season. "It's a chance," Verity said. "Thin as a single thread, but still a genuine chance worth taking." Honor's eyes followed the damp seam upward into the deeper darkness, and for the first time since the auction hall, her expression held something other than dread alone, a small flicker of the same stubborn hope that had carried Verity through the very worst moments of the bidding. "Then we'd better not waste it," she said, and the words felt considerably less like surrender than they had only 3 days before this moment. It took 3 more full days of preparation before either sister felt genuinely ready to walk back into Briarstone Crossing, their palms tender from rope work, the sheep settled enough behind their newly finished gate to be safely left under Drummer's watchful care for half a day at most. Honor rehearsed under her breath the entire way, enlisting aloud what they truly needed against what they could afford to leave, wanting a little longer, while Verity walked beside her, turning over every coin's worth of risk in her mind, knowing full well that whatever they chose to spend next might decide whether the cave became genuine shelter or merely a slower, more drawn-out kind of grave for them both. Both wore their cleaner dresses for the trip, the dark wool brushed free of dust as best they could manage, bonnets tied proper beneath the chin, in the manner expected of respectable widows facing a town's judgment. The streets felt narrower than Verity remembered from before, the boardwalks crowded with men who turned to watch the Ashcombe sisters pass by with the same sideways curiosity they'd shown openly at the auction, though now mixed with something closer to genuine disbelief that the two women hadn't simply vanished into the scrubland and quietly starved by now. Silas Garrick looked up sharp from his ledger when the small bell above his store door rang out, his eyes moving slow over Verity's split knuckles, and the dust ground deep into the worn hem of her dress before finally settling on her tired face beneath the bonnet brim. "You look like you've been fighting trees and losing," he said, not unkindly at all, and Verity allowed herself the smallest twitch of a genuine smile despite her exhaustion. "I won, actually," she answered, and that nearly drew a real laugh out of him before he caught himself short and asked plainly what the two of them needed from his shelves. "A barrel," Verity said. "The biggest one you've got that still holds water properly, and whatever tin scraps you might have stacked in the back, the narrow pieces, especially if you happen to have any worth selling." Garrick's gaze drifted toward a stack of dented metal sheets leaning against the rear wall of his store, then back to her face with open, unguarded curiosity written plain across his features. "Building a roof on that hole in the rock?" Then he asked, and when Verity told him plainly no, that they meant instead to catch water directly out of stone itself, the silence that followed held weight enough to feel almost physical between them. A man warming himself near the store's stove offered a low snort into his collar, not quite quiet enough to go unheard. "Next you'll have the rocks giving milk besides," he muttered to his neighbor just loud enough to carry across the small room. Honor's jaw tightened visibly beside her sister, though she said nothing aloud in response, schooling her face into something flat and carefully unreadable, the way Verity had taught her during the long walk back into town that very morning. Garrick rubbed at his gray chin, considering the matter seriously despite the other man's mockery. "It might actually work," he allowed at last, his tone making perfectly clear he wouldn't wager any of his own money on the outcome himself. "Wouldn't be quick, though, whatever happens." "Quick isn't the same thing as useless," Verity answered evenly, and that simple reply earned his full attention for the first time that morning, a measuring look that lingered a beat longer than was entirely comfortable for either of them. He named a price for the barrel and the tin scraps together that made Honor's breath catch audibly beside her sister. $6 total more still, if they wanted it delivered out to the property, and Verity answered without any hesitation at all that they would carry everything themselves rather than spend another precious coin on convenience. Getting the heavy barrel back to Thorne's Hollow proved considerably uglier than either sister had properly imagined beforehand, rolling it end over end across broken ground, catching repeatedly in low brush, dropping hard into hidden hollows that jarred both their arms clear up to the shoulder with each impact. Honor cursed under her breath in language Verity had genuinely never heard her gentle sister use before, not even during the very worst weeks following Caleb's sudden death. And somewhere past the second mile of struggle, she finally laughed. Instead, a startled bright sound that broke the lingering tension stretched taut between them since their earlier argument outside the auction hall. "We look like absolute fools out here," she gasped, leaning hard against the barrel to catch her breath, watching Drummer circle the noisy wooden thing with evident deep suspicion. Verity wiped sweat from her eyes despite the persistent cold, and found herself laughing too, the sound foreign and entirely welcome in her own chest after so many weeks of grim necessary labor. "We bought a cave nobody else wanted in this entire territory," she said. Looking foolish stopped mattering much somewhere back around the auction hall itself. By the time they finally reached the hollow and set the heavy barrel near the weeping wall, both exhausted women sat down hard onto the cold stone floor for a long minute without speaking another word, arms aching fierce, the autumn light slanting gold through the opening behind them both. This was precisely the moment Verity understood, without ever saying it aloud to her sister, when foolish plans usually died for good, not in public under cruel laughter, but here instead alone, after the true cost had already been paid out in coin and torn fingernails both. She forced herself upright first despite the ache, reaching for the axe to split lengths of spare timber into crude channels, while Honor took up the tin sheets instead and began bending them carefully by hand over her own knee, shaping narrow guides with a patience Verity genuinely hadn't expected to find in her younger sister before this whole ordeal began. They worked together in near silence through the remaining afternoon, hammering small nails into cracks where the limestone would actually hold them fast, wedging wood firmly where it would not cooperate. The whole arrangement tilting and slipping more than once, and forcing both women to climb back up and begin the careful work all over again. On the second afternoon of this delicate work, a sharp strip of tin sliced clean across Honor's thumb, deep enough to bleed freely down her wrist, and she hissed sharp through her teeth, but didn't stop working entirely until Verity forced the clean cloth firmly into her hand and made her properly wrap the wound before continuing. "You'll lose that thumb to rot if you let it fester untreated out here," Verity warned her sister, and Honor rolled her eyes, despite the obvious pain. Though she let her sister tie the bandage tight regardless. "We didn't survive an entire fever epidemic together just to lose fingers to a stubborn barrel now," she muttered, and something in the dry humor of the remark eased a knot. Verity hadn't even realized she'd been carrying tense in her own chest until that moment. By evening, the barrel sat beneath its makeshift gutter system, looking thoroughly absurd to any outside eye. A cooper's cask and bent scraps of tin tucked against a damp seam in ancient stone, like some desperate machine built entirely by women possessed of more stubborn determination than common sense. The first full day brought absolutely nothing for their effort. The second day brought less than nothing at all, the weeping wall looking dry enough now to actively mock every single hour they'd already poured into the project. Honor grew steadily quieter as the silence stretched on between them, feeding the sheep with mechanical, distracted care. Refusing to glance toward the silent barrel more than once each hour, though Verity could plainly see the strain of not looking written clear across her tired face. That second night they lay close near the small fire at the hollow's entrance, with Drummer settled warm between them, the silence beyond no longer feeling entirely empty, so much as expectant. Now judgment merely deferred rather than fully passed down upon them yet. Before dawn broke on the third day, a small sound finally pulled Verity hard out of sleep, soft enough at first that she nearly dismissed it outright as simple settling stones somewhere deep in the cave. Then it came again, unmistakable this time. A single clear drop and then immediately another following close behind it. She was on her feet before the blanket had even fully untangled from around her legs, the lantern swinging wild in her tight grip, as she half ran through the deepening dark, with Honor stumbling awake close behind her, calling her sister's name aloud in confused, half-formed alarm. At the rear wall, a third drop let go cleanly from the gutter's worn edge and fell straight into the waiting barrel with a sound far too small to be called anything but a genuine beginning. Verity stood with both hands braced hard against the barrel's rim, staring down at the faint dark pool already collecting slow at the bottom. And when Honor finally caught up and saw the small miracle for herself, she pressed both hands hard over her own mouth, as if afraid the cave itself might somehow take offense at joy spoken too loudly within its ancient walls. "It works," Honor whispered at last, and the simple words carried far more weight than either sister had quite expected going in. Not because the thin trickle alone solved the whole of the coming winter, but because it proved beyond doubt that this stubborn land could be made to answer back when properly asked the right question. It did not solve the deepening cold settling steadily into the cave each passing night, nor the looming question of where the sheep's own water would eventually come from, once the open creek finally froze solid for the season, nor the larger underlying truth that neither sister yet possessed a roof to call entirely her own, beyond the open stone they currently shared uneasily with 10 nervous ewes. But it proved something neither woman had been fully certain of since the gavel first fell inside that crowded laughing hall, that the rock itself would not simply swallow whatever they offered it without eventually giving something real back in honest return. Verity counted what little remained in their battered tin box that same night by lantern light, $5 now, and some scattered loose change besides, and found herself thinking less about how painfully little it actually was, and more about how genuinely much the two of them had already managed to build from even less than that meager sum. The first true hard frost arrived 2 full mornings later, silvering the surrounding scrub white and turning both sisters' visible breath to pale cloud the moment they stepped past the stone threshold into the bitter morning air. Honor stood watching the distant horizon scrape itself clean of every remaining color, her arms wrapped tight around her own ribs against the sudden cold. "Winter isn't merely coming anymore," she said quietly, almost to herself. It's already well on the road toward us, and there's no stopping it now. The sheep had proper shelter now. At least the barrel had finally begun its slow, patient work. But the main chamber still swallowed every single scrap of heat. Their small cooking fire could possibly produce the sheer vastness of surrounding stone drinking warmth, faster than either exhausted sister could hope to replace it through labor alone. They would need walls built inside walls, Verity understood with sudden clarity. A tighter space built deliberately for two human bodies in a proper stove, rather than 10 anxious sheep in open air alike, something small enough to hold real heat, the way cupped hands hold a single struck match steady against a determined wind. She chose the exact spot herself, not far at all from the dripping wall where the cave floor ran level, and the stone rising behind it stood firm and straight enough to properly anchor a real frame. Honor watched her older sister scratch the rough outline directly into the dirt floor with a stick 10 feet by 12, small enough to warm properly, large enough still to actually survive inside through the worst of the season. This feels different than building the pen did, Honor said slowly, studying the marked-out ground between them. The pen was built for the sheep alone. This one is meant for us instead. Verity straightened up from her crouch, meeting her sister's eyes steady across the rough rectangle, traced careful in the dust. That's exactly why it has to be done right the first time, she answered firmly. We can always replace a lost sheep if it comes to that. We cannot ever replace each other, not out here, not under these circumstances. The words settled between the two sisters with unexpected weight, an acknowledgement neither had spoken quite so plainly aloud before this moment, that whatever quarrels had already passed between them since that mocking auction hall, the two of them remained now each other's only true certainty across 110 acres of entirely indifferent stone and broken shale. The careful work that followed felt markedly different from everything that had come before it, more intimate somehow in its quiet demands, more exacting in its eventual consequences for them both. Verity knew the surrounding land considerably better by now, knew precisely which slope would betray her boots without warning, and which particular stand of timber held the straightest saplings worth the long walk, knew which of Honor's knots could be trusted without a second checking glance, and which ones still needed careful review before bearing any real weight. By late afternoon, the air smelled thick of fresh sawdust and cold stone and damp clay together. Both women's sleeves rolled despite the persistent chill, Honor's dark hair coming loose at her temples beneath a faded kerchief tied plain across her crown as she worked the chinking mixture carefully between the fitted logs. Verity caught herself simply watching her younger sister work steady at her task and felt something close to genuine wonder at how much had already changed in so relatively few days. How the trembling, frightened girl from the auction hall had begun almost without either of them properly announcing it aloud to become someone else entirely different and stronger. We need a door that closes properly tight against the coming wind, Verity said, one particular evening fitting the rough frame for the cabin entrance carefully, while Honor held the heavy crossbeam steady in place. We need considerably more moss for the remaining gaps, too, more than we've managed to gather so far this season. Honor's reply came back dry and visibly tired, edged with the particular gallows humor of two people grown too exhausted by then to be anything but brutally honest with one another. If I split one more board wrong tonight, I may very well throw this entire hammer clear to the territorial line. Out of pure spite, she said, and Verity laughed despite the permanent ache already settling deep into her own shoulders. The unexpected sound startling drummer from his comfortable doze near the small fire. It was a small thing, really. That shared laugh hardly worth remarking upon at all, except that neither sister had laughed freely together like that since well before the fever first took both their husbands within 10 days of one another, and the cave itself seemed to hold the sound a moment longer than it strictly needed to, almost as if even ancient stone could somehow recognize something genuinely worth keeping close. The cabin's rough walls rose slowly across the following days, log set carefully upon log, the gaps packed tight throughout with mud and dried grass until the seams held firm against even a determined testing wind from outside. They were fitting the door frame's final brace into place, Honor steadying the heavy timber while Verity drove the last wooden peg firmly home, when the sound of distant hoofbeats reached them both from beyond the stone gap. Faint at first, and then growing swiftly unmistakable against the rocky approach below. Drummer was on his feet instantly at the sound, a low growl already building deep in his chest, and both sisters froze mid-motion together. Honor's wide eyes finding Verity's across the half-built frame, with a question neither dared voice aloud just yet. A rider's dark shape filled the bright opening, and for one suspended, terrible moment, Verity's entire body went rigid with sudden certainty that Thorne himself had finally come to finish what the auction hall had only started weeks before. Then the approaching figure resolved instead into something smaller, considerably less imposing a man, dismounting with the careful, uncertain movements of someone genuinely unsure of his welcome at this particular door. And the breath Verity had been holding tight released all at once when she finally recognized Silas Garrick leading a heavily loaded mule behind him. He stood blinking slow as his eyes properly adjusted to the dimmer interior light, taking in the finished sheep pen. First, then the neatly stacked timber, then the barrel positioned beneath its dripping wall, and finally the half-finished cabin frame, rising stark from the stone floor, where two tired women stood still holding hammers in their raw hands. He didn't speak right away at all, and the resulting silence stretched long enough that Honor finally broke it herself, wiping her dusty palms against her worn apron with some forced composure. "You found us out here?" she said simply. Garrick nodded slow, still looking carefully around the entire chamber, as though recalculating something important in his own head. "You gave fair directions," he answered at last, and began loosening the heavy sacks from his mule's back flour and dried beans and coarse salt and ground coffee, considerably more than they had actually ordered from him, more than they could honestly afford to pay for at present. "I didn't order any extra lamp oil from you," Verity said carefully, watching him set a small tin can down beside the other delivered supplies. "No," he agreed simply enough, "you certainly didn't order that." The quiet admission hung between them without any further explanation offered, and Verity found she genuinely didn't have the remaining energy left to argue against the small kindness she desperately needed regardless of its origin. From somewhere near the rear wall came the faint, steady sound of the barrel's slow drip, and Garrick's gray brow lifted visibly at the sound, his head turning instinctively toward it. "So the rock truly does give something up after all, given enough proper persuasion," he said, half to himself it seemed. "Only if you ask it the right way," Verity answered evenly, and watched something shift subtly in his weathered expression as he studied her closely, taking in the new steadiness in her gaze that certainly hadn't been present back at the auction hall. The way she now stood, like a woman who genuinely belonged to this strange, impossible place, rather than one merely surviving inside it day by day. "Payment can wait safely enough until the lambs come in spring," he said finally. And when Verity opened her mouth to firmly refuse what felt uncomfortably like outright charity, he cut her off smooth with a dry breath that was almost a laugh in itself. "Don't you dare call it charity then, if that troubles your pride so much. Call it instead a man simply liking his own odds better after seeing properly what you two have already built way out here against every expectation." He tied the mule's now empty lead rope to his saddle and mounted up without further ceremony, though he paused once more before finally riding back out, his eyes moving slow over the cabin frame one last time. "You're truly certain about staying through the entire winter season?" he asked, and Verity's answer came back without any hesitation. This time, whatever doubt she might have voiced honestly only weeks earlier already burned clean away by sheer necessity and hard labor both. "We're staying right here," she said firmly, and Honor, standing close beside her sister, said nothing further herself, but didn't contradict the statement either. And that particular silence felt like its own quiet kind of solemn agreement between the two of them. They watched together until the sound of his mule's hooves had faded entirely down the rocky slope below, and Honor finally exhaled long and slow into the gathering evening dusk around them. "He didn't laugh at us once," she said, sounding almost genuinely wondering at the fact itself. "Not a single time through that whole visit." Verity turned back toward the unfinished cabin frame, already calculating silently how many more days of steady work remained before the walls could properly hold heat against the coming cold season. "Some people are finally starting to look at us properly," she said. "It took the storm we haven't even fully weathered yet to make even a few of them start doing that much." That night, the two sisters cooked simple beans over their small fire and split a generous portion for Drummer, besides the coffee brewed weak enough to barely color the water at all. And yet it tasted, Honor admitted, around a careful mouthful, considerably richer than any single meal she could properly remember from the comfortable life they'd both left behind inside the Thorne household. They slept close together near the unfinished cabin walls that particular night, the deepening autumn cold already sharp enough to bite straight through their layered blankets. And somewhere, well past midnight, Honor's quiet voice finally broke the surrounding dark, uncertain and small. "Do you suppose Thorne already knows by now," she asked softly, "that we haven't simply given up and crawled back to beg his forgiveness?" Verity stared up at the entirely invisible ceiling above them, listening close to the faint, steady rhythm of the barrel's distant drip somewhere beyond the dying firelight. "He'll know soon enough, regardless," she answered honestly. "And when he finally does learn of it properly, he won't take the news kindly at all." The wind shifted faintly outside just then, carrying the first true sharp edge of approaching winter on its breath, and somewhere in that long, quiet stretch before sleep finally claimed them both completely. Verity understood with sudden, settled clarity that whatever fragile peace they'd managed to find together across these last difficult weeks of constant labor was only the opening note of a far longer reckoning, still waiting patiently somewhere down the long road that led directly back toward town in Obadiah Thorne's considerable, wounded pride. The lamp oil Garrick had generously left behind burned through considerably faster than either sister had properly anticipated the early dark of late autumn, stretching their available working hours uncomfortably thin with each passing week. Verity found herself carefully rationing the precious light the same way she once rationed flour back in better days, doling it out sparingly only for tasks that genuinely couldn't wait safely until proper dawn arrived. The cabin's rough walls stood fully complete by the first week of December. The heavy door finally hung true upon leather hinges Honor had patiently fashioned from a worn old harness strap. But the persistent problem of real heat remained one. Neither careful timber work nor mud chinking alone could properly solve for them. A simple pit fire built near the cabin center choked the entire low room with thick smoke within barely an hour's time, forcing both exhausted sisters back out, coughing hard into the larger main chamber. Eyes streaming raw, the brand new walls already smelling faintly of failure before they'd even been properly lived inside at all. "We genuinely need a proper stove of some kind," Honor said firmly, sitting hunched on an overturned crate with her sleeve pressed hard against her own watering eyes, "or we'll surely suffocate ourselves entirely before the first real hard cold even properly arrives this season." Verity turned over carefully every single scrap of metal the two of them currently owned between them. An old iron cooking pot with a cracked rim salvaged carefully from among Thaddeus's remaining belongings. Two bent sheets of rough-patched tin, twisted wire, and raw clay, and whatever loose stones she could properly shape toward the purpose at hand. It wouldn't be anything close to a proper manufactured stove. Certainly nothing like what was sold through the catalogs back east, but it would simply have to become something considerably uglier and smarter than anything they'd previously attempted together. She built the rough hearth carefully into the cabin's rear corner atop a solid base of flat rock, packing thick clay tight around the cracked iron pot to form the firebox's central hot core, hammering the available tin flat and curling it patiently into crude pipe, sealed carefully with wet clay and twisted wire at every single joint along its length. The proper venting proved by far the truest problem facing them both, since smoke naturally had to travel somewhere useful, and the cabin's deliberately low roof offered absolutely no kindness at first careful inspection. Verity had noticed a narrow natural fissure high up in the cave's ceiling during her much earlier explorations of the chamber, little more really than a dark seam splitting through solid stone. And she'd watched faint telltale drafts stir restless there. On the coldest morning since clear evidence, the crack likely ran somewhere upward toward open air far above their heads. If it genuinely reached the surface above, it might properly draw the dangerous smoke clean away from their living space. If it somehow didn't reach through the small cabin, would fill swift with poisonous air faster than either exhausted sister could possibly hope to escape it in time. She built a crude scaffold from spare poles lashed roughly together, climbing it carefully with the makeshift pipe, balanced awkward against one shoulder. Her skirts gathered and tucked beneath a length of rope to keep the hem clear of her feet, while Honor paced anxious tight circles some 20 feet below Drummer, whining low at the scaffold's base as though somehow sensing the genuine danger even before either woman had spoken it plainly aloud between them. "Don't you dare look down now." Verity muttered low to herself, wedging the pipe's top end carefully into the waiting fissure with hands that had already begun shaking visibly from both the considerable height and the bitter cold combined. Honor's voice carried up worried from below tight with genuine fear. If that entire scaffold gives way beneath you, I'm honestly not strong enough alone to carry you safely back to the cabin by myself, she called up anxiously. And Verity forced out a laugh she didn't entirely feel in that precarious moment. Then I suppose we'd both better sincerely hope it holds steady, she called back down. She climbed back down afterward on legs gone genuinely unsteady, with relief once the pipe finally sat secure above, carried a single glowing coal carefully from the outer fire into the waiting new hearth, and laid careful kindling inside with hands still visibly trembling from the scaffold's considerable height. The small flame caught first faint, then steadily larger, and for one entirely breathless second, absolutely nothing happened at all between them. Then thick smoke rolled back hard out of the firebox in one great punch that filled the entire cabin, instantly sending both coughing sisters lunging desperate for the door, eyes streaming raw lungs burning fierce with the acrid bite of green wood and wet clay combined. Verity smothered the stubborn flame quickly with sand, while Honor coughed hard, doubled over near the threshold outside, and when the very worst of it finally cleared away, the two exhausted sisters sat together upon the cabin's bare dirt floor, staring grim at the freshly blackened hearth, in a silence neither one particularly wanted to break first between them. It would have been entirely easy in that discouraging moment to simply call the whole ambitious effort finished for good, to quietly admit that a cave could perhaps be borrowed temporarily as shelter, but never truly properly made into anything resembling a real home. The draw is simply too weak as built, Verity said, finally studying the pipe's exact angle through her own still streaming eyes. The natural fissure runs considerably higher than what I originally gave it credit for. We need noticeably more length added and better sealing throughout every joint. Honor wiped fresh soot carefully from her cheek with the back of one hand. Exhaustion plain, written across every line of her tired face. Yet something stubborn still flickered there too underneath it all. Something that genuinely hadn't existed in her quite so visibly 3 full weeks earlier than this moment. Then we simply climb that wretched scaffold again, first thing tomorrow morning, she said, her voice rough, still from all the coughing, but clearly resolute beneath it regardless. I certainly didn't survive cutting my own thumb wide open on sharp tin scraps, just to now die quietly of smoke inhalation instead. The following morning brought a proper second section of pipe, carefully fashioned from additional hammered scraps, sealed considerably more carefully this time, at every single joint, pushed steadily higher up into the natural crack, until its very top finally vanished entirely from sight above them. When Verity lit the small fire a careful second time, the resulting smoke lingered only a brief moment before pulling cleanly upward, thin and steady, disappearing completely into solid stone the way water naturally disappears into dry sand. Real heat gathered slow inside the small room after that, a gentle hush of warmth against their shins at first, then steadily, more enough, finally, that the cold, sharp biting edge genuinely lost its teeth entirely. Honor stood very still in the open doorway, watching faint steam rise visible off her own damp sleeves in the gathering warmth, and something close to genuine tears gathered fresh in her eyes that had nothing whatsoever to do with lingering smoke this particular time. "We actually did that together," she said quietly, sounding almost disbelieving even now. "With nothing but scraps and raw clay and a simple hole in solid rock, we built something that genuinely works properly." Verity touched the stove's warm clay side carefully, with the back of her fingers, feeling real heat radiate steady and entirely true beneath her palm, and allowed herself finally a rare, unguarded smile of her own. "We certainly did manage it," she agreed warmly. "Though I genuinely thank you not to ever mention the part where I very nearly fell clean off that scaffold to anyone in town." They slept properly inside real walls for the very first time that particular week, a narrow cot pushed close against the room's warmest corner, glowing coals breathing soft red through the stove's rough mouth, long after the lantern had been finally extinguished for the night. Outside their small cabin, the larger surrounding cavern remained cold and vast and genuinely ancient as ever. But within their own raised walls, winter had finally been properly pushed back by something considerably stronger than mere hope alone could provide. The fragile peace lasted barely 4 full days before the first real sign of serious trouble finally found them both arriving not as Thorne himself in person, but instead as word carried secondhand through Garrick during his next regular supply visit. His usual cheerful expression, notably grimmer than the goods he'd actually brought along with him this time. Word's gone steadily around that Obadiah Thorne has personally spoken now to most every trader between here and the territorial line itself, Garrick said, unloading his sacks with considerably more force than strictly necessary. His jaw set tight with evident frustration. Told them plain and clear not to extend any further credit to either of you two, not for feed, not for tools, not for absolutely anything that might genuinely help you both survive through this coming winter season. Verity felt the careful words land hard like a physical blow against her chest. The careful arithmetic of their rapidly dwindling coin, suddenly far more fragile than she'd previously allowed herself to honestly believe possible. He surely cannot simply forbid an entire town from doing honest business with us, she said. Though even as she spoke the words aloud, she already knew exactly how much real weight one bitter old man's personal grudge could genuinely carry in a place this small and tightly knit. Garrick's uncomfortable silence answered the question fully before his careful words eventually did. He's not exactly forbidding it outright, technically speaking, he said carefully, just quietly making it known plain enough where his considerable favor currently lies, and equally where it certainly doesn't anymore. Most folks around these parts still genuinely owe him something significant, a loan, an old debt, some favor from years back. They'll naturally think twice now before openly crossing him on your particular account. Honor's face had gone visibly pale throughout the entire troubling exchange, her hands stilling completely on the heavy flour sack she'd been carrying steady toward the cabin door. So we're truly and entirely alone in this now, she said, her voice considerably smaller than it had sounded in many days. Even the handful of people who might have genuinely helped us before are now simply too afraid to risk it. Garrick's weathered expression softened slightly at her obvious distress, though the worry itself never quite left his steady eyes. Not entirely alone, not by any means, he said firmly. I'll personally keep selling to you both plain and fair, whatever that bitter old man might privately think of it. But I genuinely won't lie to either of you and pretend it's nothing at all to worry about. A man like that simply doesn't easily forget a public slight, and he certainly hasn't forgotten the considerable one you two handed him square at that crowded auction hall. When he'd finally ridden back off with his now empty mule, the two weary sisters stood together quiet in the rapidly cooling afternoon light, the genuine weight of his troubling news settling considerably heavier with each passing silent minute between them. That same evening, while Verity worked carefully at mending a small tear in the sheep pen's main brace beam, she noticed Honor slip quietly away from their small fire with unusual care, claiming some sudden need of fresh air despite the bitter cold already gathering thick outside the cabin walls. Something in her younger sister's hurried, furtive departure pricked sharp at Verity's careful attention, a definite wrongness she couldn't immediately properly name to herself. And she set down her mending tools to follow at a careful measured distance behind her. She found Honor standing near the cave's wide stone opening, a small folded scrap of paper trembling visible in her hands, the worn stub of a pencil tucked behind one ear. Several words already half written before she heard her older sister's careful approach and startled hard enough to drop the entire page right into the dirt below. What exactly is that? Verity asked carefully, though. Some cold certainty already gathering tight in her own stomach had guessed the troubling answer well before Honor could properly speak it aloud herself. Her younger sister's face crumpled visible with something caught between guilt and genuine desperation, and for one long, terrible moment, neither woman said anything further at all between them, the cold wind simply carrying loose grit back and forth in the heavy silence. I was honestly going to ask him directly if his earlier offer still properly stands, Honor finally admitted, her voice breaking hard on the difficult words. The one he made to us before to simply buy us both out entirely, to let us go somewhere instead, with an actual proper roof and actual decent neighbors who don't openly laugh whenever we happen to walk past them in the street. I'm simply not as strong as you are, Verity. I genuinely don't know how much longer I can possibly keep doing this kind of life out here. The raw confession hung exposed in the cold evening air between them, and Verity felt something twist sharp and sudden beneath her own ribs. Not quite anger exactly, something considerably closer to genuine grief instead. You'd hand him exactly what he's always wanted from us both, Verity said, her voice low and visibly shaking now with an emotion she struggled honestly to properly name even to herself in that raw moment. After absolutely everything we've already built together with our own two hands, You'd simply let him buy it all out from under us, the very moment things finally grew genuinely difficult for once. Honor flinched hard as though physically struck by the words, but didn't entirely back down from her position either. Difficult, she repeated, her own voice rising now in turn. Verity, we have absolutely no remaining credit anywhere in town anymore. We have exactly $5 left between us and a homemade stove. We very nearly choked ourselves to death building properly. I'm not trying at all to betray you here. I'm simply trying to survive this entire winter without dying out here alone, proving some abstract point to a bitter old man who never once looked at either one of us as anything more than property to be conveniently disposed of when it suited him. The raw words struck considerably harder than Verity had quite expected, landing somewhere genuinely true, even straight through her own building. Anger. And for one long moment, the two sisters simply stared hard at each other across the gathering darkness. Between them, their breath clouding visible in the cold air, the rock face yawning entirely indifferent at both their backs. Verity bent down slow and retrieved the dropped paper carefully from the dirt below, scanning the few desperate lines Honor had already begun writing before her sudden interruption, and something in seeing her younger sister's careful handwriting, laid bare like that. The normally neat loops, gone visibly shaky now, with genuine fear, softened the sharp edge of her own fury into something considerably gentler, though no less urgently felt. Thaddeus told me about this particular cave on an ordinary ride home from town. Once, she said quietly, folding the troubled paper carefully closed rather than tearing it outright, as some part of her genuinely wanted to do in that moment. He pointed straight at the mesa and said plainly it was dry. Said it was genuinely something worth knowing if anyone out there ever properly had the sense to use it right. I didn't fully understand back then that he was actually leaving me something close to a map. Not simple comfort exactly, not some shared future together we'd never actually get the chance to properly live out. Survival itself. That's truly all it was ever meant to be from the start. Honor's eyes filled fresh with tears, her sharp anger finally draining away into something considerably rawer and more honest between them. And what happens if it genuinely isn't enough? In the end, she whispered, what if we do absolutely everything right and the harsh winter simply takes us anyway regardless? I'm so terribly tired of constantly having to be brave, Verity. I honestly don't know how much actual bravery I have left remaining inside me anymore. Verity crossed the short distance between them, swift, and pulled her younger sister into a fierce embrace, tight enough to startle a small, broken sound loose from Honor's throat. The particular kind of crying that only comes after many weeks spent successfully holding it firmly back. We don't have to be properly brave every single hour of every single day. Verity murmured low against her sister's loose hair, her own voice noticeably unsteady now too in turn. We only ever have to be brave today, and then simply brave again tomorrow morning, one single day stacked carefully upon the next, until eventually we look back together and realize the entire winter is finally behind us, instead of still stretching out ahead. Honor's shoulders shook hard against her for a long while before the worst of the sobs finally eased off. And when she pulled back at last, her eyes were red-rimmed but noticeably steadier now. Something genuinely resolved settling firm into the set of her jaw that hadn't quite been there only moments before this exchange. I won't write to him again, she said finally, quiet but certain. I'm truly sorry I even considered doing it in the first place. Verity squeezed her sister's hand once hard, in honest acknowledgement rather than outright forgiveness exactly, since there was genuinely nothing much to forgive, in fear honestly spoken aloud between two people who loved each other. Then we simply keep building together, she said firmly, side by side or not really at all. They returned together to the cabin in a silence that felt notably different from the silence of their earlier argument, lighter somehow despite everything. Two women who had tested the limits of their fragile partnership and found it against every reasonable expectation, still standing firm. That night, as Honor finally drifted into an exhausted sleep beside the stove's dying glow, Verity sat alone a while longer, mending the torn cuff of her only remaining good dress by lantern light. The needle, small and stubborn between fingers grown thick and rough from weeks of hard use, thinking how strange it was that a woman might learn to build a chimney through solid rock and still not know how to properly thread a needle without squinting half-blind in poor light. The following weeks brought a punishing, relentless rhythm of labor. Neither sister had fully anticipated when they'd first set out from town, splitting and stacking firewood endlessly against the stove's hungry appetite, reinforcing the sheep pen's weaker joints one by one, hauling water from the barrel in increasingly larger quantities as the open creek beyond the mesa began its slow, inevitable seasonal freeze. The frost thickened with each passing morning, furring every exposed surface of brush and stone alike in pale crystal, and the sisters fell into a working rhythm shaped entirely by daylight's shrinking hours, rising before the gray dawn properly broke and working straight through until the lantern's oil made further labor wasteful. Honor took over the regular task of checking the barrel each morning before anything else, a small ritual that had become almost sacred between them. Kneeling careful beside the cask to judge the night's collection by touch and sound, before either woman spoke a single word to the other. Verity in turn walked the pen's perimeter daily, checking each fastening by hand, her fingers learning the particular give and tension of every knot, until she could tell by feel alone whether the cold had worked any rope loose overnight. It was a small comfort, this division of careful labor. Two women who had once known nothing of livestock or carpentry, now moving through their morning chores with the unconscious competence of people who had simply done a thing enough times that their bodies no longer needed instruction from their minds. It was during one such ordinary evening, the two sisters splitting kindling together near the cabin, while Drummer dozed close to the warmth of the small fire, that the dog's head snapped suddenly upright without warning. Ears pricked hard toward the deeper darkness of the main chamber beyond a low growl, building steady in his throat that neither woman had quite heard from him before in their time here. Deeper and considerably more urgent than his usual warnings reserved for strangers approaching along the road. Honor froze mid-swing of her hatchet, the blade hanging suspended. "What is it?" She breathed out quiet, and Verity was already reaching fast for the lantern, every honed instinct screaming caution, even before she fully understood what exactly had triggered the dog's sudden alarm. The sheep stirred uneasily in their pen nearby, a ripple of nervous bleating spreading swift through the entire huddled flock, and somewhere beyond the lantern's weak reach came a sound neither sister could immediately properly place, a low, deliberate scrape of claw against cold stone. They moved together, cautious, toward the pen lantern held high between them. Drummer pressed close against Verity's leg with hackles raised stiff along the length of his spine. At the very edge of the lantern's light, where the cave's natural darkness still held complete dominion beyond the reach of their small flame, two pale eyes caught the glow and held perfectly steady, low to the ground, entirely unmoving, in a way that froze both women's breaths solid in their chests. "A cougar," Honor whispered the single word barely audible between them, her hand finding her sister's arm in a grip tight enough to leave bruises later. Verity's rifle stood leaned uselessly against the cabin wall some 20 feet behind them, both far too distant to retrieve without turning her back fully on the waiting threat. And even if she somehow managed to reach it in time, the cave's strange twisting acoustics made any clean shot in such darkness considerably more dangerous than simply no shot at all under these conditions. The big cat's shoulder shifted slow, a visible ripple of dense muscle beneath tawny fur, even in the dim light, and Drummer's steady growl rose abruptly into something closer to a full snarl, his entire body trembling now with the considerable effort of holding firm position rather than charging forward recklessly. Verity's racing mind cycled through every available option and found genuinely none of them entirely safe, until her desperate eyes finally caught the heavy iron skillet hanging from its peg near the cabin door, a second matching one resting just beside it, and something in her chest steadied at once, with sudden clear purpose. "Get behind me now and grab the other skillet quick," she told her sister, voice low but unmistakably firm, and Honor obeyed instantly without a single moment's question. The two of them retreating just far enough to snatch up the heavy iron pans before turning back together to properly face the waiting threat as one. Verity slammed the two heavy skillets together with every single ounce of remaining force her tired arms could possibly muster, and the resulting sound that erupted from the violent impact was genuinely monstrous, doubling and breaking hard against the cave's surrounding stone walls until it returned amplified into something that seemed to rise from every single direction simultaneously, a ripping metallic roar that had no natural counterpart anywhere in the animal world beyond this place. The cougar's pale, watching eyes vanished instantly at the sound, the creature's entire shape melting backward fast into the surrounding darkness, and Verity struck the heavy skillets together again and again without pause. Honor joining the relentless assault a beat later, with her own matching pan, the combined deafening noise filling the entire cave like the sudden waking fury of something considerably larger than two exhausted, frightened women defending a small flock of sheep. Drummer lunged forward, barking himself genuinely raw into the retreating darkness ahead, though the predator's shape had already fled well beyond any possible pursuit, and only when her own arms finally failed her completely did Verity lower the heavy skillets at last, breathing desperately hard, her ears ringing far too loudly to immediately hear the sheep's continued distress around her. When her hearing slowly cleared a moment later, the flock stood crowded together and visibly trembling, but largely intact overall, save for two unfortunate ewes pressed hard against the pen's far corner. Fresh blood matting the wool thick along one animal's haunch, where a sharp claw had caught flesh, before the deafening noise finally drove the predator off entirely. Honor knelt fast beside the injured animal, first her hands shaking visibly as she examined the deep wound carefully by lantern light, her voice tight now with barely controlled panic beneath the words. "This one's torn considerably deep," she said. "I honestly don't know if we can manage to save her through the night." They worked together through the remainder of that long night, by lantern glow, alone cleaning the deep wound carefully with what little clean water still remained to them, packing it tight with crushed herbs. Anna remembered clear from her late mother's old remedies, binding the whole wound tight with strips torn carefully from a worn petticoat neither sister could properly afford to spare but did anyway without hesitation. The second injured ewe proved considerably less fortunate in the end, her injuries notably deeper than they'd first appeared in the dim light, and by the time dawn finally broke gray, the animal lay still in the corner of the pen. The first true and undeniable loss either sister had suffered since beginning this entire impossible venture together. Honor sat quiet beside the dead ewe in the cold gray morning light, exhaustion and genuine grief mingling plain across her tired face. While Verity forced herself instead to properly assess what actually remained to them now, 8 living sheep where they'd originally started with 10, just weeks before the harsh arithmetic of survival, growing noticeably crueler with each passing difficult week out here. "We genuinely cannot keep doing this without some kind of proper protection in place," Honor said, finally, her voice rough still from the long night's exertion. "The rifle, the dog, 2 battered pots, and a desperate prayer. None of it feels remotely like enough protection anymore after tonight." Verity nodded slow in agreement, already turning carefully over in her mind what reinforcements remained genuinely possible within their badly dwindling means. A considerably stronger barrier built across the sheep pen's weakest side, a line of loose tin scraps strung careful where any future disturbance would clatter loud enough to properly wake them both, even from the deepest exhausted sleep. They spent the following several days rebuilding entirely what the brutal attack had already tested and found wanting doubling every fastening throughout, bracing the main gate with a considerably heavier beam salvaged from their already dwindling timber stock. The grim work proceeding mostly in heavy silence, broken only by occasional necessary instruction between them. It was during this difficult period of careful repair that Obadiah Thorne himself finally returned his horse, picking careful way up the rocky approach with the deliberate caution of a man genuinely unused to traveling such broken ground. Personally, his fine coat heavy and warm against the steadily worsening cold settling over the territory. Drummer's low growl this particular time carried clear recognition rather than pure unfamiliar alarm, and both sisters straightened slow from their ongoing repair work to watch him dismount carefully near the stone gap, his sharp eyes moving immediately over the entire scene laid out before him. The freshly rebuilt pen, the neatly stacked wood, the small cabin with its thin thread of smoke still rising steady from the hidden fissure above. Something flickered briefly across his weathered expression that might genuinely have been surprise, quickly smoothed away beneath the same hard composure he'd worn steady throughout the original auction. "I happened to be nearby," he said, the obvious lie evident plain in the careful way he avoided meeting either sister's direct gaze throughout. "Thought I might properly see whether harsh circumstance had finally introduced you both to some genuine reason at last." Verity wiped her raw hands slow on her worn apron, refusing entirely to let him see how badly the recent cougar attack had genuinely shaken her own resolve even slightly. "We're managing well enough on our own," she said evenly. Thorne's gaze drifted slow toward the injured ewe's bandaged haunch, clearly visible even from his considerable distance, and something almost satisfied crossed briefly across his weathered features before he carefully masked it away again. "Sheep losses already this early in the season," he observed coolly. "This cave isn't quite the fortress you both clearly imagined it to be then. This remains no fit place at all for decent women, regardless of whatever shelter it might happen to offer from the weather itself. Honor's voice cut in sharp before Verity could properly respond, herself considerably sharper than her sister had honestly expected from her. "We've lost exactly one sheep total to a cougar attack," she said firmly. "Your own operation, by Garrick's honest account around town, has already lost considerably more than that to simple neglect of proper fence repair this entire season." Thorne's jaw tightened visibly at the sharp rebuke, his careful composure cracking just enough finally to reveal the genuine temper simmering beneath it. "I made the two of you a fair offer once already," he said, pressing forward despite the unwelcome interruption. "I'll make it plainly again now so there's no remaining confusion later between us. $20 total for the land itself, 20 more besides to properly cover whatever you've already sunk into these various improvements. Take the money and find somewhere considerably more fit to be properly seen in public. Somewhere a respectable woman wouldn't feel ashamed to receive proper callers." There it was again. Verity thought grim, watching the old man's calculated offer land hard between them like a closed fist disguised poorly as genuine generosity. Not real concern at all, not even basic respect for their considerable effort. Only the same reflexive, desperate need to own and therefore erase whatever had managed to prove him entirely wrong. "The land simply isn't for sale," Verity said, her voice steady despite the deepening cold settling further into her bones with each passing minute of this tense exchange. His jaw worked once hard, visible anger flickering plain beneath his weathered features. "Pride remains an expensive luxury for women in your current position," he said coldly. "So is badly underestimating the very people you've already cast out once before." Verity answered evenly, watching something shift minutely at the corner of his mouth. A flicker of recognition he clearly hadn't expected to genuinely feel in this moment. For one brief moment, his gaze drifted past her toward the sheep pen itself. The coming spring lambs already visible plain in the swell of several ewes' bellies, despite the recent attack's heavy toll, and whatever careful calculation passed behind his eyes in that instant seemed only to harden further rather than soften his stated resolve. "When this winter finally closes its hand properly around you both," he said, finally mounting his horse with stiff, deliberate movements, "you'll learn precisely then what a truly bad bargain actually looks like up close." He turned without further ceremony and rode back steady down the slope, his shape gradually diminishing against the gray horizon until the scrub finally swallowed him entirely from view. Neither sister spoke for a long moment following his departure, the chamber settling back slow into its familiar quiet, though something unsettled still lingered heavy in the air long after the sound of his hoofbeats had completely faded away. Verity found the cleanly cut rope at dusk 3 full days later while completing her regular evening check of the pen's various fastenings, the severed end hanging clean and deliberate from the gate's far hinge, where any sudden hard tug in the night might easily have opened enough space for the entire flock to scatter wild into darkness and waiting predators both. This rope wasn't simply worn through naturally, she said, her fingers tight around the frayed strands as Honor crossed quick to examine the troubling damage herself. Not loosened, gradual by strain or weather either. Cut clean deliberately with a sharp blade. Honor's face drained pale in the fading evening light. He said plainly he wouldn't help us anymore. She said slow, the full troubling weight of the implications settling heavy between them both. "He never actually said he'd leave us entirely be, though, did he?" They worked together through the gathering dark to replace the cut rope with salvaged chain from an old harness, doubling every other fastening throughout, with knots pulled tight enough to whiten Verity's knuckles, completely bracing the main gate with timber considerably heavier than before, despite the heavy toll it took on muscles already thoroughly exhausted from the cougar attack's lingering aftermath. By the time they finally finished the work, the sky had turned the particular color of old iron, no stars visible at all through whatever heavy weight pressed steady down from above the very air itself, carrying a stillness that felt considerably less like genuine calm than active anticipation. Verity stepped outside once more, before full dark finally settled, completely studying the western horizon, where pale gray had already swallowed the usual ridgeline silhouette entirely from view. The year now turned fully into the dead heart of an 1884 winter, unlike anything either sister had weathered before in their comfortable former lives. "Something is genuinely coming," she said, when she returned to where Honor waited patient, near the small fire, and her sister's eyes met hers with the particular shared understanding that had grown steady between them over these difficult recent weeks, an unspoken language built entirely from shared labor and shared fear in equal measure. "We've prepared as much as we possibly can manage," Honor said, though her voice carried considerably more question in it than genuine certainty. Verity nodded slow, already mentally cataloging their remaining stores. The woodpile stacked noticeably higher than usual against pure instinct alone. The extra feed sacks they'd hauled in carefully against Garrick's last delivery. Every single tool too valuable to risk losing, now brought safely inside the cabin's protective walls. "We'll know soon enough whether it was truly enough," she said quiet. They spent that final evening before the weather properly turned in careful, deliberate motion together, securing the heavy wooden barrier firmly across the lower opening, checking every single brace twice over, settling the nervous sheep deeper into the chamber where solid stone offered the most genuine protection from whatever fierce wind might find its way through the remaining gaps. Honor fed the stove one extra precious log, despite their badly dwindling supply, and the two exhausted sisters sat close together near its warm glow, listening careful to the first hints of wind beginning to rise steady outside a low moan, building gradual into something carrying real weight and clear intention behind it now. Drummer paced restless near the cabin door, refusing entirely to settle down, his ears tracking sounds neither woman could yet properly identify clear through the thickening walls of stone and timber both. "I keep thinking back on what Garrick told us," Honor admitted, quiet, staring deep into the stove's orange glow, rather than at her sister beside her. "About how most folks in town remain too afraid of Thorne to ever cross him openly on our account. What happens if that same fear extends to helping us properly if something truly goes badly wrong out here?" Verity considered the troubling question with the same careful weight she now gave to everything. The casual certainties of her old, comfortable life, long since stripped entirely away by weeks of hard labor and genuine loss both. "Then we simply won't have anyone left to rely upon but each other, and that dog there," she said finally. "Same as we've genuinely had since that very first auction haul, really, when you think it through properly. We've managed to come this far on exactly that much between us." Honor's hand found her sister's steady in the firelight, fingers interlacing now with a grip that spoke considerably more of solidarity than lingering fear. The earlier desperation of her secret unfinished letter, already feeling like the distant memory of an entirely different, weaker version of herself from before. Outside, the wind's low moans sharpened gradual into something carrying real teeth. Now the first scattered hiss of driven snow, audible plain against the wooden barrier they'd reinforced so carefully only hours before this moment. Verity rose to check the main brace beam once more, running her palm careful along its rough surface in the dim light, feeling the heavy wood already beginning to shudder faint under the wind's steadily mounting pressure. "This storm is genuinely going to test absolutely everything we've built together," she said, more to herself, really, than directly to her sister. Though Honor heard the quiet words clearly enough regardless, and rose to stand firm beside her at the barrier, both women bracing instinctively together as a particularly hard gust struck the heavy planks with force enough to make the entire structure groan audible in its supports. "We held firm against a cougar already," Honor said, her voice steadier now than Verity had honestly expected given the building chaos gathering just beyond their thin wooden defense. "We'll hold firm against whatever this storm decides to bring us to." Verity genuinely wanted to believe the confidence carried plain in her sister's voice matched some real certain knowledge of the eventual outcome ahead, and as she finally pulled the heavy cabin door shut against the rising dark, sliding the bar home with hands that had grown strong enough across these difficult weeks to no longer shake at all, she allowed herself one last look back through the gap toward the barrier, holding firm at the hollow's wide stone opening, toward the sheep settled deep in the barrel still dripping. Faithful in the dark, every single piece of the strange, impossible life the two of them had carefully built, now waiting together to learn exactly what this winter truly intended to ask of them. By midnight, the moan had become a roar. Snow no longer simply falling, but driving instead in long white sheets sideways against the wooden barrier, the structure groaning continuous under a living weight of wind that seemed genuinely determined to find every remaining weakness in its careful bracing. Inside the small cabin, the stove glowed deep, steady orange, its clay sides holding heat like banked sunlight, even against the storm's growing fury outside. Yet even there, both exhausted sisters felt the considerable pressure of it, heavy in the very air itself, a vastness pressing down hard from beyond their thin walls that made the small room feel simultaneously like genuine sanctuary and something closer to a trap. Drummer refused entirely to sleep through it, lying close near the door with his head raised, steady ears tracking every subtle shift in the wind's rising pitch, releasing low rumbling sounds at intervals that had nothing whatsoever to do with any single identifiable threat, and everything instead to do with the storm's sheer overwhelming presence, as if the blizzard itself were some vast living animal, trying determined to nose its way inside their shelter. Verity sat wrapped in her shawl near the stove's mouth, listening to the wind test every seam of the cabin one by one, and found herself thinking of her mother's old saying about Wyoming winters, that the territory took its tax from everyone equally rich man and widow alike, and simply waited to see who'd paid enough in preparation to keep what they owned. Honor lay curled beneath their combined blankets on the narrow cot, not asleep, but not fully awake either. Her breathing shallow and quick in the way Verity had come to recognize, as fear held carefully in check rather than absent altogether. "We should try to rest while we can," Verity said quietly, though she made no move herself to lie down. Honor's eyes opened slow in the dim orange light. "I keep waiting to hear something break," she admitted. "The waiting is somehow worse than the wind itself." The cave changed the storm's entire character. Verity came to understand slow as the long hours dragged forward relentless, the wind outside screaming sharp and genuinely wild, while the sound finally reaching them filtered through. Stone arrived instead, blunted and rolling, a deep violence properly softened by solid rock, that neither shook loose nor rattled apart under the sustained assault. It absorbed the blizzard's considerable fury whole, and answered back instead with silence and sheer weight. And this she realized slow watching Honor's exhausted profile, lit faint in the stove's steady glow, was precisely why the very earth itself seemed somehow to stand firm with them, here in this place. Though she honestly hadn't possessed the proper words for it back at the original auction, when raw fear alone had driven her impulsive bid. When proper dawn should have finally arrived, the cave remained dim still as full dusk snow already piled high enough hard against the barrier to seal away nearly all outer light entirely, and Verity rose stiff from her narrow cot to check carefully on the sheep-pen lantern, raised steady against the darkness that pressed considerably closer now than usual. The flock stirred uneasy, but not yet genuinely frantic, their breath hanging pale visible in air, gone colder now than any single night before it. The temperature dropped severe, though not quite yet the genuine killing cold she suspected raged entirely unchecked beyond their protective stone walls outside. She checked the water barrel next in turn, finding the steady drip still continuing despite everything happening around them. That small, persistent sound somehow striking her considerably harder than the storm's full roar had managed throughout the night, proof solid that some essential part of this place continued its quiet, patient work, regardless of whatever chaos gathered fierce outside. Everything they'd carefully built across these difficult recent weeks was being properly tested simultaneously. Now all at once, the pen and the stove and the barrier and the patient barrel together. Every single hour of hard labor reduced finally to one single narrow question that admitted no possible partial answers whatsoever. Did it hold firm or didn't it hold at all? The first full day trapped inside the storm's considerable grip passed slow in small tasks that felt genuinely enormous, precisely because of everything waiting silent beyond them. Feeding the nervous sheep with careful attention, taken not to waste even a single precious scrap, checking the cabin's various seams repeatedly for any fresh drafts clearing accumulated drift that found its persistent way through small gaps in the barrier despite their absolute best reinforcement efforts. Honor melted fresh snow carefully in their largest pot, only to compare the result against the barrel's considerably cleaner water, and find fresh renewed reason for genuine gratitude in the stark comparison between them. While Verity rationed their precious woodpile, with an accountant's careful precision, calculating silent exactly how many days remained before they genuinely need to risk venturing back out for more fuel, regardless of whatever conditions awaited them. Neither exhausted sister wasted many words during these long grinding hours. Raw fear given purposeful work instead of any voice, though. By evening, sheer exhaustion had worn both women's careful composure, thin enough that even small things now threatened to crack it entirely apart. By the time true darkness fell again on that first full day, the cold inside the cabin had begun creeping past even the stove's steady reach, and Honor took to wearing her good wool shawl pinned over her work dress. Both garments layered thick beneath the man's coat that had once belonged to Caleb, and which she'd carried with her from the Thorne house, without quite knowing why, until this very night gave the reason its full weight. Verity noticed her sister's hands trembling, not from fear now, but from simple cold, as she ladled out their thin evening soup and said nothing of it, only passed the warmer side of the pot, her sister's way without comment, the kind of small, unspoken kindness that had become its own steady language between them over these difficult weeks. Toward midday on that grueling second day, the relentless wind worsened, further still arriving now in long, hammering bursts, violent enough that fine powder hissed steady through gaps around the barrier, despite every careful effort made to seal them properly. Spreading thin white lines steady across the cabin's dirt floor, that Honor swept patiently back with grim determination every few exhausting hours. Verity tied a worn scarf tight across her nose and mouth before venturing carefully out into the main chamber to shovel accumulated drift away from the lower opening. And it was during this exposed, dangerous labor that a sudden gust struck with enough raw violence to boom the entire barrier. Hard against its straining supports, the frightened sheep jolting hard in their pen at the deafening sound. Verity dropped her shovel instinctively and threw both arms tight around the main brace beam, holding it firm against the wind's considerable pressure with her entire body weight, while the structure shuddered violent beneath her grip like something genuinely alive and straining hard to break free entirely. Honor appeared beside her within seconds, having heard the violent impact even clear through the cabin's thick walls, adding her own considerable strength to the straining beam. Without a moment's hesitation, despite her notably smaller frame, both exhausted sisters braced together now against a force that seemed genuinely determined to test exactly how much each of them was truly willing to sacrifice for this impossible, stubborn piece of land. The fierce gust finally passed after what felt like an eternity, the beam holding entirely true beneath their combined desperate weight, and Verity stood breathing genuinely hard, with her cheek pressed cold against the frozen wood, feeling a strange, fierce calm move steady through her entire chest, even as her tired arms trembled hard with the considerable strain. "Not today," she said directly to the raging storm itself, her voice barely audible above the wind's continued furious howl. And Honor's answering laugh beside her carried equal parts genuine exhaustion and pure defiance, a sound that belonged entirely now to the woman she had truly become, rather than the trembling, frightened girl from that distant auction hall weeks earlier. That same exhausting evening, while checking the cabin's eastern wall for fresh drafts, Honor discovered a crack she hadn't noticed before, a thin line running diagonal through the mud, chinking near the stovepipe's base, where the constant heat had finally worked the clay brittle enough to fracture under the storm's relentless pressure. "We need to patch this now before it widens," she called to her sister, already working loose a fresh measure of clay from their dwindling stores despite the late hour. Verity joined her quick, both women working by lantern light to seal the crack properly before the cold could find its way through their breath, visible even inside the cabin's warmth. As the patching work demanded, they keep the door cracked slightly to let the fumes clear. It was tedious, frightening work, made considerably more difficult by exhaustion and the storm's continued howling beyond their thin walls. But by the time they finished, the patch had set firm, and Honor pressed her palm flat against the repaired seam with something like reverence in her tired expression, as though confirming for herself that the small fix would genuinely hold against whatever remained of the storm's fury. By the third long night, the relentless blizzard had stretched well beyond any normal measure of passing time. The entire world outside the cave reduced completely now to pure whiteness and overwhelming sound. No visible horizon anywhere. No sky genuinely distinguishable from Earth itself in the endless driving snow. The cabin's small stove-lit circle of warmth had become quite literally the entire boundary of Verity's present existence. Certainty contained entirely within four log walls, while everything beyond remained pure, unrelenting force outside. She sat upon the narrow cot, with both hands wrapped tight around a tin cup gone fully cold an hour earlier, watching the stove's steady glow flicker through its rough mouth. Drummer finally asleep at last, with his paws twitching faint through some private dream of his own. Honor curled close beside her sister under their combined blankets, breathing slow but not entirely peaceful, even now in restless sleep. Thaddeus came to her clear in the half-light between waking and dreaming that particular night, not as he'd looked at the very end, fevered and steadily fading toward a death neither of them had genuinely been ready for, but instead as he'd appeared on one ordinary autumn afternoon, long before reins held loose in one hand, pointing steady toward the distant mesa, with that same thoughtful certainty he'd always brought naturally to everything he did. "Dry cave," he'd said, "simply good one. If a body ever properly had the sense to use it right." She understood now finally and completely what she'd only half grasped during those first desperate days back at the original auction that he'd left her. Something considerably closer to an actual map than mere memory. Not simple comfort exactly. Not the shared future together they'd both naturally assumed lay safely ahead of them, but survival itself instead, handed forward across a distance neither one of them could have ever properly anticipated. There were genuinely many different kinds of inheritance, she thought, slow watching the coals breathe soft red in the surrounding dark. Some arrived wrapped in purses of cold coin, pressed hard into a grieving widow's palm at a closing doorway. Others arrived instead in a single remembered sentence, proving its true worth only once every other available door had finally shut completely. The quiet thought steadied something deep in her chest that had been trembling faint since the storm's very first hour, and she allowed herself finally at last a few precious hours of genuine sleep, before the fourth approaching dawn brought any real answer to what the relentless blizzard ultimately intended for them both. When she woke at last, the profound silence struck her first, total and complete in a way that felt almost more genuinely alarming than the storm's full roar had ever managed, until her sleepy mind finally caught up to register what the sudden absence actually meant for them. The wind had thinned away to absolutely nothing. No battering snow striking the barrier any longer. No hammering gusts testing the brace beam's considerable limits. Only the faint shift of sheep settling quiet in their pen. The steady drip continuing at the barrel. The soft pop of coals still glowing inside the stove. Drummer rose first among them, stretching long before padding steady toward the cabin door, his nose lifted toward whatever fundamental change he'd sensed even before Verity herself fully understood it. "It's truly done now," she said quiet, waking her sister with a gentle hand placed soft on her shoulder, though the words carried considerably more hope than genuine certainty until she'd properly confirmed it for herself outside. The hard work wasn't finished by any means, though, not by any reasonable measure. Snow packed hard enough against the lower barrier that it took several hours of determined, exhausting shoveling before they finally managed to force the bottom planks loose enough to squeeze carefully through the narrow gap into whatever remained of the world outside. When Verity finally stepped beyond the stone threshold, the brilliant light struck her eyes with such sudden, overwhelming brightness that she had to turn her face away entirely, blinking hard against a glare the world simply hadn't shown her in 4 long days. The entire landscape beyond the mesa had been erased completely and rewritten fresh in pure white drifts, rising considerably higher now than the fence posts she clearly remembered setting outside. Weeks before, every familiar contour of brush and stone smoothed now beneath hard glittering curves, shaped patient by the relentless wind into something almost genuinely beautiful in its sheer violence. The bitter cold bit clean straight into her lungs, considerably sharper than anything the cave's protective interior had properly prepared her for, and the sky overhead stretched pale and entirely brittle blue, scoured clean of every single cloud that had spent 4 long days trying, determined to bury them alive completely. Honor emerged behind her sister's shovel, already gripped firm in hand, and stood for a long, silent moment, simply staring at the utterly transformed world, with an expression that mixed genuine awe and total exhaustion in equal measure between them. "It's genuinely beautiful," she said finally, her voice hushed with wonder. "And it very nearly killed us both." Both things felt entirely true simultaneously. Verity thought quiet, beginning the slow, careful work of clearing a narrow track from the hollow's opening toward the woodpile they'd carefully banked beneath an overhang. Many days earlier, the two sisters working now in easy tandem with the practice coordination that weeks of shared hard labor had genuinely built steady between them. They widened a careful path enough for the sheep to reach a small sheltered patch nearby during the calmer hours, marking the trail's edges, careful with poles salvaged from spare timber, so fresh falling snow wouldn't erase their only safe route between proper shelter and necessary supply. Every single motion required deliberate care. Now a single careless misstep into some hidden hollow, capable of costing a badly twisted ankle, that this far removed from any possible help, might prove every bit as dangerous as the storm itself had genuinely been to them. A full week passed slow in this hard, unbroken white stillness, the two sisters establishing a careful, steady rhythm of survival amid the considerable aftermath, checking the surviving flock twice daily, without fail, maintaining the stove's hungry, constant appetite for fuel, watching the distant horizon, careful for any further genuine sign of returning weather. During those quiet days, Honor took to mending what the storm had loosened, restitching a torn seam in her coat, replating frayed rope ends, small, careful tasks that seemed to steady something in her that the larger labor of survival could not quite reach, while Verity spent the hours assessing what remained of their stores with the particular grim arithmetic the territory had taught her, counting feed sacks and firewood, and the dwindling store of coffee with an accountant's unsentimental eye, already calculating how many more weeks they could stretch what little they had left before the roads opened enough to risk the trip back into Briarstone Crossing. It was during this quiet, watchful interval, the bitter cold still severe, though the immediate danger had clearly passed, that Honor first noticed the lone rider approaching slow across the drifts, a dark shape moving with the slow, careful caution of both horse and man, no longer entirely trusting the treacherous ground beneath them. Drummer stiffened, visible at Verity's side, but didn't bark this particular time, only watched steady. And something in his careful restraint told both sisters clearly that this particular approach carried considerably different weight than Thorne's previous visits had ever carried before. When the horse finally reached level ground near the stone opening, the man who dismounted slow looked genuinely older now than the version who'd ridden away angry weeks earlier with threats of bad bargains still hanging cold in the air between them. Not older exactly by mere years, but by some visible toll the brutal storm had clearly extracted from him. Personally, his fine coat stained, now his weathered face hollowed in a way that spoke clear of sleepless nights and considerably harder losses than simple wounded pride alone could properly explain away. His careful eyes moved first over the surviving sheep, counting them visible even from his considerable distance, then traveled slow across the cleared path. The neatly stacked wood, the thin thread of smoke still rising faithful from the hidden fissure above the cabin, before finally settling steady on Verity herself, standing calm in her work coat with chapped raw hands wrapped tight around a shovel handle, steady as the very stone surrounding her. "You're genuinely alive," Thorne said, the words carrying something considerably closer to real surprise than his usual cold, careful composure typically allowed. "We are indeed," Verity answered, simple, watching something complicated move slow behind his weathered features. His gaze drifted back steady toward the flock once more, and whatever he properly saw there seemed to tighten something visible across his face that hadn't been present during any of his earlier visits. "We lost nearly half our entire herd," he said finally, the difficult admission clearly costing him something genuinely significant to voice aloud at last. The north pasture barn roof gave way completely the second night of the storm. The drifts took the entire lower lot before we could properly move them to safety. We dug until our hands bled raw and still couldn't reach half of them in time to save them. The bare confession hung stiff and exposed in the cold air between them. The same man who'd once stood proud in a warm hall and severed his daughters-in-law completely from his household, with nothing but a purse of cold coin, now standing humbled before the very cave he'd once mocked openly as rock and ruin, admitting plain that his own carefully built wealth had ultimately failed him utterly, while their seemingly impossible gamble had genuinely survived intact throughout. Honor moved one careful step closer to her sister's side, watching the tense exchange with cautious silence. Drummer sitting alert and watchful between the two sisters and the man who'd once threatened them with nothing more than his own bitter contempt. "You were genuinely fortunate," Thorne said finally, the words coming out thin and entirely unconvincing, even to his own ears apparently, since he didn't properly meet either sister's steady gaze as he spoke them aloud. Verity could have answered honestly that fortune had genuinely little to do with months of careful preparation and deliberate calculation, that simple luck didn't build proper pens or carve water channels through solid stone, or hold a straining brace beam steady against a wind determined utterly to tear it free. Instead, she said only simple that the cave had kept what truly mattered safely out of the storm's considerable reach, watching him slowly absorb the simple truth of it without any further argument offered. His eyes drifted past her steady toward the cabin's dim interior, the rising cooking smoke, the clear evidence of a genuine life properly built rather than merely barely endured, and something shifted visible behind his weathered expression that hadn't been present during any previous visit before this one, a recognition arriving slow and entirely unwelcome to him. "I'll buy it from you," he said abrupt, the old familiar reflex surfacing, even now, even here, right at the very edge of his own evident humiliation before them. Not apology exactly, not genuine praise for everything they'd properly accomplished, only the same desperate, reflexive need to own and therefore somehow erased whatever had managed to prove him entirely wrong about them both. The land itself, the surviving flock, every single improvement you've made out here. Name your honest price, and I'll meet it twice over without question. Verity nearly laughed aloud at the tired wonder of watching a man remain so entirely himself even now, though absolutely no humor reached her steady voice when she finally answered him plain. "It simply isn't for sale," she said, and watched his jaw harden visible at the flat refusal. "Everyone eventually sells given the right price," he pressed harder, his voice rising now with something considerably closer to genuine desperation than real authority. "No," Verity said firm. "Everyone simply doesn't sell." The cold wind moved light across the crusted snow between them. Somewhere deep inside the cave, a young lamb bleated faint, and Thorne stared hard at her for one long charged moment, anger and wounded pride, and the raw ache of his own significant recent losses, all visible plain in equal measure across his weathered face. But beneath all of it together, Verity clearly recognized something she'd genuinely never once seen directed toward either sister. Before this moment, not during the funeral, not during the original auction, not during any of his previous visits here, dripping thick with contempt disguised poorly as concern. Recognition plain and entirely unwilling. Not of their grief exactly, certainly not of their former place within his family any longer, but instead of their genuine right to stand exactly where they currently stood, having properly earned it through means he could neither dismiss outright nor adequately explain away to himself. He looked away first, finally gathering his reins with hands that trembled slight from either cold or genuine emotion, perhaps both combined together. "You've made a genuinely strange thing work out here," he admitted finally, the closest his considerable pride would ever allow toward real acknowledgement between them. Verity rested both hands steady against her shovel's worn handle, meeting his gaze directly despite everything that had passed between them since that auction hall's original mocking laughter. "It works because we listened carefully to what it genuinely needed from us." She answered simple, and watched him slowly absorb the small but deliberate distinction. Without any further comment, offered the plural pronoun carrying weight. She rather suspected he understood perfectly well, even if he chose not to address it directly between them. He gave one small nod finally, almost against his own evident will, in the moment before turning his tired horse back steady toward the trail he'd originally come by, growing steadily smaller across the white expanse, with each careful step, until distance finally swallowed him entirely from view. Only once his distant shape had vanished completely did Verity finally release the breath she'd been holding tight throughout the entire tense exchange, her shoulders dropping sudden with exhaustion as the built-up tension of confrontation finally drained away from her. Honor moved to stand close beside her sister, watching the empty horizon where Thorne had finally disappeared. Her expression caught somewhere between genuine relief and lingering wariness that neither sister entirely trusted yet to dissolve so easily after everything that had passed between their two households. "Do you genuinely believe that's truly the end of it now?" Honor asked quiet, her voice carrying the particular caution of someone who'd already learned hard lessons about trusting newfound peace too quickly. Verity considered the careful question seriously before answering, turning over everything she'd properly witnessed in Thorne's expression during this final confrontation between them. The genuine cost, visible plain in his hollowed face, the unfamiliar weight of recognition that had briefly cracked his usual hard composure. "I think he's lost enough now that further cruelty would genuinely cost him more than he's truly willing to spend going forward," she said finally. "Though I won't pretend that necessarily makes him entirely harmless either. Only change, perhaps, in whatever small ways a man like that remains genuinely capable of changing at all." That evening, with the immediate danger of the encounter finally past, Honor sat mending the hem of her work dress by the stove's glow, while Verity tallied what little remained in their tin box, the careful arithmetic of survival shifting now from pure desperation towards something closer to cautious planning. "We'll need to think about the spring planting soon," Honor said, not looking up from her needle. "Root vegetables, if the southern ground thaws kindly enough. Something beyond simply surviving each single day as it comes to us." Verity glanced up at the words, something easing faintly in her chest, at the sound of her sister thinking now in seasons, rather than merely in the desperate arithmetic of single days strung together. "That's the first time you've spoken of spring as though you actually believed in it," she said. Honor's needle paused mid-stitch, and a small, tired smile crossed her face in the dim light. I suppose I finally do believe in it, she admitted. 4 days of that storm taught me something about belief I hadn't properly understood before this winter. The following weeks brought a slow, gradual thaw to both the surrounding landscape and something considerably less tangible between the sisters and the wider community of Briarstone Crossing itself. Word of the storm's considerable aftermath, traveling faster than either Verity or Honor had genuinely anticipated, through whatever informal channels carried such news steady across the territory. The roads remained treacherous a while longer, yet deep ruts frozen hard beneath fresh slush. And the sisters used the enforced waiting to take proper stock of everything the winter had cost them, and everything it had, against all reasonable expectation, allowed them to keep. Honor began sketching rough plans for an expanded garden plot on a scrap of paper salvaged from Garrick's last delivery, while Verity walked the property's full perimeter for the first time since the blizzard, noting where fresh repairs would be needed once the ground softened enough for proper digging. The whole 110 acres of broken shale, looking in the pale winter light, considerably less like a joke now than it had on that mocking auction day months before. When the roads finally opened enough for safe travel again, the two sisters made their very first trip back into town since well before the blizzard, a small sleigh loaded behind their mule, with 2 healthy lambs born early. Despite the harsh conditions, clear evidence of genuine survival that needed absolutely no further explanation once properly witnessed directly by the townspeople. They dressed with particular care for the journey. Both women in their cleaner dresses brushed free of the worst dust bonnets tied proper beneath the chin, though no amount of careful dressing could fully hide the new leanness in their faces, or the weathered look that months of hard labor had carved permanently into hands, once soft from parlor needlework. Verity caught her own reflection once in the cabin's small shaving mirror before they departed and barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because she'd aged so terribly in mere months, but because something steadier had settled into her expression that hadn't been there at the auction, something that no longer flinched from difficult things before they'd even properly arrived. The streets of Briarstone Crossing still bore dirty ridges of old packed snow, the boardwalks creaking steady beneath thawing boots, and the assembled men gathered around Garrick's stove fell genuinely quiet when the two sisters entered together. Though Verity noted immediately, this particular silence carried considerably different weight than the auction hall's original mocking stillness had months earlier. This one listened carefully rather than simply judge them outright. Garrick looked up slow from his ledger, taking in the healthy lambs visible through his window, before returning his careful attention to Verity's weathered face, marked now plain in ways that spoke clear of everything she'd properly endured since their last meeting together. "Heard your place came through clean enough," he said. Warm, and Verity felt something genuinely loosen in her chest at the simple welcome acknowledgement. "We came through it together," she answered, simple. One of the men near the stove, the very same rancher who'd once offered cruel speculation about rocks and bats during the original auction months before, shifted his weight uncomfortable before clearing his throat slow. "Did you lose any sheep?" he asked carefully, the question carrying genuine concern now, rather than any lingering mockery. "We lost exactly one to a cougar attack before the storm hit," Honor answered honestly, refusing entirely to inflate their genuine survival into something cleaner than the actual truth. None at all to the blizzard itself, though, thankfully. The rancher gave a low whistle. He attempted poorly to hide within his beard, clearly impressed despite himself, while Garrick rounded his counter to examine the healthy lambs more closely through the window, his trained eye assessing their good health with evident genuine approval. "Good strong legs on them both," he observed careful. "Sound backs, too, by the look of things." He named a genuinely fair price for the pair of lambs, then added that he might properly take more come spring if the rest of their flock proved equally strong and healthy, an offer that represented far more than simple commerce between them. Verity understood clear a genuine vote of real confidence from a community that had spent months openly expecting their certain failure out there. The rancher by the stove spoke up again, considerably more careful this time, his earlier mockery entirely absent now from his changed tone. "Does that cave of yours genuinely keep the cold off that well?" he asked, and Verity met his gaze directly before answering simple. "Better than pride ever does," she said, and watched several men around the stove laugh aloud at the honest response, though this particular laughter carried absolutely no cruelty in it. Now even the rancher himself offering a short, genuine grin and a respectful tip of his head, as if properly accepting the gentle rebuke for exactly what it was meant to be. A younger man standing near the door, dressed in the plain canvas of a working ranch hand, spoke up from where he'd been quietly listening to the entire exchange. "My pa runs the spread 2 ridges east of yours," he offered, somewhat awkward in the sudden attention. "Said your place held through that storm better than half the proper homesteads in the valley did. Wanted me to ask whether you'd consider selling breeding stock come next season once your flock's built back up proper." The question landed with an unexpected weight, the first genuine business proposition either sister had received since arriving in the territory, and Verity felt something steady move through her chest at the simple practical respect embedded plain in the young man's careful phrasing. "We'd consider it," she answered, and watched him nod satisfied before retreating back toward the door with the particular relief of someone who'd successfully delivered a difficult message. Garrick counted out real honest earnings into Verity's open palm, then money that represented genuine commerce now, rather than the pity or severance she'd once associated entirely with coin-changing hands between people. She found herself purchasing needed supplies with a confidence entirely absent from her very first desperate visit to a store many months earlier. Flour and sugar and fresh coffee and additional nails, and a proper new lantern to replace their battered original, and good warm wool cloth Honor had been quietly craving since the very worst of winter's cold had first settled deep into her bones. When Verity hesitated briefly over a mattress tick displayed near the counter, weighing its cost carefully against their still cautious budget, Garrick simply told her plain to take it that she genuinely earned softer sleep than bare boards could ever properly provide, and absolutely no one in the entire store offered any argument against the small, well-deserved kindness. The walk home that particular afternoon felt considerably lighter than any journey since the original auction, despite their sled riding noticeably heavier now, with fresh supplies, honest coin warming her pocket. Drummer ranging happy through the thawing edges of remaining snow, as though he too genuinely sensed the fundamental shift in their circumstances. "We didn't win by becoming someone else entirely," Verity said to her sister as they walked together steady. "We won simply by staying exactly who we already were when everyone expected us to break instead." Honor considered the words a long moment before answering, her breath still visible in the lingering cold. "I think we became someone too, though," she said carefully. "Just not someone different from who we started as. Someone more fully what we already were underneath everything before grief made us forget it for a while." Spring arrived properly late and thoroughly muddy that year across the entire territory. Old packed snow, withdrawing first into ugly gray ridges, before finally dissolving completely into shining streams that ran hard down every gully and wash surrounding the mesa. Fresh green returned slow to the scrubland in cautious patches beyond the hollow's wide limestone face, while inside the barrel filled considerably faster than ever before. The seasonal thaw evidently loosening whatever reluctant moisture the ancient stone had been carefully hoarding through winter's very worst months. The lambs born during the storm's immediate aftermath grew strong and bold within their pen, their playful cries brightening the cavern's deeper chamber in ways that made the entire space feel genuinely inhabited now, rather than merely barely survived. Honor expanded their small enclosure as the warming weather steadily permitted breaking fresh ground near the mesa's southern edge for root vegetables she'd been carefully planting since the depths of winter itself. The seed packets come dear from Garrick's store, carrots and turnips, and a small precious measure of cabbage seed, and she planted each row with the same careful precision she'd once brought to fine needlework, measuring the spacing by hand and murmuring half-remembered advice from her mother about proper soil warmth that Verity suspected was equal parts genuine wisdom and comforting ritual both. People began stopping by occasionally now, not many of them, not terribly often, but enough genuinely to mark a real shift in how the two sisters were perceived throughout the surrounding territory. A neighboring rancher's wife arriving one warm afternoon, wanting plainly to purchase 2 ewes for her own modest flock. A passing ranch hand asking in a voice he tried unsuccessfully to keep properly casual exactly how deep the famous cave actually ran, beyond what casual visitors could see from the hollow's face alone. One particular afternoon in late spring, Garrick himself wrote out unprompted fresh coffee beans and a folded catalog of tools balanced careful across his saddle. His easy manner relaxed in a way that suggested this particular visit carried no urgent business behind it at all. He stood near the stone opening with his hands hooked loose in his vest, surveying the entire established homestead with an expression that suggested the place had genuinely become a landmark he was still gradually adjusting to in his own mind. "Do you plan on staying in there permanently?" he asked. And Verity glanced back steady toward the cabin. The well-established pen, the neat woodpile stacked careful against next winter's eventual return. The path of natural light reaching deep enough now into the cave to properly warm the pale stone surface near the entrance. "For now at least," she answered honest, and he nodded slow at the simple response, considering it careful. "Then I suppose folks will simply keep right on saying you two live in a hole," he observed, though his tone carried gentle teasing now, rather than the old mockery that particular phrase had once clearly implied. Verity lifted one shoulder in casual dismissal. "Let them say what they like," she said. Garrick's answering smile carried genuine warmth. "Hard to properly mock a hole that turns this much honest profit," he said, and rode off shortly after with the easy manner of a man who'd simply enjoyed checking on neighbors he'd come genuinely to respect over these difficult months, the dust settling slow behind him in the warming spring afternoon air. That same particular evening, as the sky beyond the limestone face opened slow into bands of rose and brilliant gold, the last light reaching deep enough to warm the pale stone near the hollow's wide opening, while the inner cavern retained its familiar cool shadow. Throughout, Verity sat on the simple bench she'd built against the cabin's outer wall, watching her sister tend the small garden plot with evident quiet satisfaction in her steady work. Drummer rested his head against Verity's knee, content and entirely unbothered, while the surviving sheep shifted soft behind their gate nearby, and from the small stovepipe hidden within its natural fissure, above the faintest thread of smoke, rose steady and dissolved into the gathering evening air. Clear evidence of a hearth that had genuinely survived everything winter could possibly throw against it. Honor straightened slow from her garden work, eventually wiping dirt careful from her hands, before settling onto the bench beside her older sister, both women watching the changing evening light together in comfortable silence that needed absolutely no further words to properly fill it between them. "I keep thinking about that first night," Honor said finally, breaking the comfortable quiet with a thought that had clearly been forming through the long working hours of this gentle spring evening together. "When I told you I didn't know how to be the kind of woman who survives a place like this." Verity glanced sideways at her sister, something gentle moving across her tired features. "You learned," she said simply. "We both did together." Honor shook her head slow, considering the words more carefully. "I don't think I learned to be a different kind of woman," she said. "I think I learned I already was one underneath all that grief and fear. The cave just gave me a reason to find out." When our husbands died, Honor continued, her voice steady now, in a way it hadn't quite managed during those first terrible weeks. "Other people decided what remained of our entire lives without ever once asking either one of us properly. A simple burden, 2 widows to be handed cold coin and quietly removed from sight altogether. They mistook our genuine loss for weakness." Verity finished quiet, watching the last color begin fading slow from the western sky beyond the hollow's wide face. "Mistook our careful silence for surrender, our genuine need for smallness in their eyes. They were entirely wrong about us," Honor said, and something in her steady voice carried the full weight of everything they'd properly survived together since that mocking laughter first rose through Briarstone Crossing's crowded hall months earlier. "The cave proved it to them, first of all." Verity agreed quiet. "Time will properly prove it to everyone else eventually, if it hasn't already begun doing exactly that." Honor reached for her sister's hand in the gathering dusk between them, Their joined grip rough now with matching evidence of months spent building something neither woman had genuinely believed herself capable of constructing, back when raw grief alone had seemed likely enough to swallow them both entirely whole. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't bid that day? Honor asked after a while, the question carrying genuine curiosity, now rather than the old bitterness it might once have held. If you'd simply let the auctioneer move on to the next lot, and we'd taken whatever coin Thorne offered and gone somewhere safer instead. Verity considered the question seriously, turning it over the way she'd learned to turn over every difficult thing these past months, with patience rather than panic. I think about it sometimes, she admitted, but I don't think we would have survived that version of our lives any better than we nearly didn't survive this one. At least this way, whatever we lost trying to build something rather than simply waiting for someone else's mercy. Honor squeezed her sister's hand at that, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them that needed no further words to complete it. We should think about expanding the cabin before next winter arrives, Honor said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence with characteristically practical concerns. Perhaps a proper second room now that we've got the resources to attempt it without risking everything on a single gamble the way we did the first time. Verity smiled faintly at the suggestion, recognizing in it the full distance her sister had traveled from that trembling girl who'd once begged to abandon this entire venture rather than risk facing one more difficult day. You're already planning improvements for a winter that hasn't even properly arrived yet. She observed something warm threading through her voice. Honor shrugged, entirely unbothered by the gentle teasing. Someone has to think ahead, she said simply. You taught me that much. Even if you'd never claim credit for the lesson yourself. In the cabin's small window lantern, light glowed warm and steady against the deepening dark outside. Not grand by any measure the town's wealthier families might properly recognize as such, but entirely their own, regardless belonging to no one else's permission or approval whatsoever. As the last color faded fully from the sky beyond the hollow's face, an evening settled gentle around the two sisters seated together on their hard-won bench. Verity felt absolutely no further need to answer anyone who might still doubt what they'd properly built here together, no remaining urge to prove anything further to a town that had finally come around to seeing them, clearly no lingering desire whatsoever to seek out Thorne's grudging acknowledgement, or anyone else's for that matter. The land itself had already spoken plain enough on their behalf. Through every difficult season, it had thoroughly tested them, and every genuine challenge it had ultimately allowed them to properly survive together. In that particular voice, she understood now, with complete and entirely settled certainty, would continue speaking long after the specific details of this hard winter had faded gently into simple local legend. The enduring story of two sisters who'd bought a hole in the rock that nobody else wanted and made it answer back with absolutely everything a proper home was ever truly meant to provide.